Thomas Miller was only 12 years old when he found himself completely alone in the world. The small wooden cabin where he lived sat right at the edge of the frontier, surrounded by thick forests on 3 sides and a small creek on the 4th. It wasn't much to look at, really. The roof leaked when it rained hard, and the wind found its way through gaps in the walls during winter. But it was home, and it was all Thomas had left. His parents had died just 8 months ago. The fever had come through the area like a silent thief, taking lives without warning. First his mother fell ill, then his father just 3 days later. Thomas had tried everything he knew to help them. He'd made them soup, kept them warm, and prayed every night. But nothing worked. Within 2 weeks he was burying them both behind the cabin, next to the old oak tree where his mother used to hang laundry. The nearest town was a 2-day ride on horseback, and Thomas didn't even own a horse anymore. He'd had to sell it just to buy flour and salt to get through the last few months. Now he was truly on his own, living off what he could grow, hunt, or gather from the forest. Every morning, Thomas woke up before sunrise. He'd check on his chickens first, collecting whatever eggs they'd laid. Some days there were 3 eggs, some days just 1. He'd learned not to expect much. Then he'd tend to his small garden where he grew potatoes, carrots, and beans. His father had taught him how to care for the plants, how to pull weeds without disturbing the roots, and how to tell when vegetables were ready to harvest. Hunting was harder. Thomas had his father's old rifle, but ammunition was precious. He couldn't waste bullets on missed shots, so he'd learned to set snares for rabbits and squirrels. It was patient work. Sometimes he'd check his traps and find nothing for days. Other times he'd catch enough meat to last him nearly a week if he smoked it properly. The loneliness was the worst part. Thomas could handle the hard work. He could manage the hunger when food was scarce, but the silence, the emptiness of the cabin at night, that was something he never got used to. He'd find himself talking out loud sometimes just to hear a human voice, even if it was his own. In the evenings, after his chores were done, Thomas would sit by the fireplace and remember his parents. His mother's laugh, his father's strong hands showing him how to whittle wood, the stories they'd tell before bedtime. Those memories were precious, but they also made the loneliness sharper. Other settler families had left the area after the fever passed through. They'd packed up their wagons and headed back east where there were doctors and neighbors in proper towns. A few had asked Thomas if he wanted to come along, but he'd refused. This cabin, this land, it was all he had of his parents. Leaving felt like abandoning them, so Thomas stayed. He learned to be careful, to plan ahead, to waste nothing. He kept his rifle loaded and within reach. He'd heard stories about dangers in these parts, about wild animals and sometimes conflicts between settlers and the native tribes who lived in the mountains. His father had always treated everyone with respect, and they'd never had trouble. But Thomas knew he was vulnerable now, a child alone. Each night he'd check the door twice to make sure it was bolted. He'd bank the fire so it would last until morning. Then he'd curl up on his bedroll, listening to the sounds outside. The hoot of owls, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of wolves. Sometimes those sounds scared him, but over time they became familiar, almost like company. Thomas knew he couldn't live like this forever. Eventually winter would come again, harder than the last. Eventually his supplies would run too low, or he'd get sick, or something would happen that he couldn't handle alone. But for now he survived. Day by day, task by task, he kept going. He'd often stand at the edge of the clearing around his cabin, looking out at the vast wilderness that stretched in every direction. It was beautiful in a way, all those trees and mountains and open sky, but it was also overwhelming. The world felt too big and he felt too small. Still, Thomas didn't give up. His father had taught him that Miller men didn't quit, no matter how hard things got. So every morning he got up. He did his chores. He found reasons to keep going even when he didn't feel like it. And he hoped that somehow, someday, things might get a little bit easier. The autumn had started to settle in, bringing cooler nights and the smell of changing leaves. Thomas knew he needed to prepare for winter. He needed more firewood, more preserved food, and repairs to the cabin roof. The list of tasks seemed endless, but he tackled them one at a time. That's how life was now, simple, hard, and lonely. But it was his life, and he was determined to live it the best way he knew how. Little did Thomas know that everything was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Thomas's life changed forever. The sun was hanging low in the sky, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. Thomas had spent most of the day working on his firewood pile, chopping and stacking logs until his arms ached. Now he was making his way down to the creek to check the rabbit snares he'd set 2 days earlier. The path to the creek was narrow and winding, cutting through thick brush and between tall pine trees. Thomas knew every root and stone along the way. He'd walked it hundreds of times. The forest was quieter than usual that day. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Thomas noticed it but didn't think much of it. Sometimes the woods just went quiet for no obvious reason. He was about 20 feet from his first snare when he heard something that made him freeze. It was a sound that didn't belong in the forest, a soft whimpering, almost like a wounded animal. But there was something human about it. Thomas's heart started beating faster. His hand instinctively went to the knife on his belt. For a moment he considered turning back. Going toward unknown sounds in the wilderness was dangerous. But curiosity and concern pushed him forward. He moved slowly, carefully, trying not to make noise. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was definitely human. Definitely someone in pain. Thomas pushed through a thick patch of bushes and stopped dead in his tracks. There, lying beside a fallen log covered in moss, was a girl. She looked a bit older than him, maybe 14 or 15. Her clothing was unlike anything worn by settler families. She wore a deerskin dress with intricate beadwork, and her long black hair was braided. Thomas immediately knew she was from one of the native tribes. His first instinct was fear. He'd heard stories from other settlers about conflicts with native people. Some of the stories were scary, full of warnings and danger, but he'd also heard his father say that most of those stories were exaggerated, that the native people were just protecting their land and families like anyone would. The girl's eyes were closed and her face was twisted in pain. Thomas's fear melted away when he saw the blood. Her left leg had a deep gash, probably from a fall or an accident. The wound was still bleeding and her skin looked pale. She'd clearly been there for a while, maybe hours. Thomas knelt down beside her, his hands shaking slightly. He didn't know what to do. Should he help her? Should he run back to the cabin and pretend he never saw her? What if her people came looking for her and found her with him? What would they think? But even as these questions raced through his mind, Thomas knew what his parents would have wanted him to do. His mother had always said that kindness didn't have a color or a language. His father had taught him that when someone needed help, you helped them. It was that simple. Thomas touched the girl's shoulder gently. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a second they were filled with fear. She tried to push herself up, tried to move away from him, but the pain in her leg made her cry out. She said something in a language Thomas didn't understand. Her voice was weak, frightened. He held up both hands, trying to show her he meant no harm. He pointed to her leg, then to himself, then made a gesture like carrying something. He was trying to tell her that he wanted to help, that he could take her somewhere safe, but he didn't know if she understood. The girl looked at him for a long moment. Thomas could see the fear in her eyes slowly mixing with something else. Maybe hope, maybe desperation. She was clearly too weak to get far on her own. She said something else in her language, and though Thomas couldn't understand the words, the tone seemed less frightened. Thomas moved closer and carefully examined her leg. The cut was deep and needed to be cleaned and bandaged quickly. He pulled off his shirt, leaving just his undershirt, and tore his outer shirt into strips. He pressed one strip against the wound to slow the bleeding. The girl winced but didn't pull away. Then came the hard part. Thomas needed to get her back to his cabin, but she couldn't walk. He was small for his age, and she was nearly his size. He didn't know if he had the strength to carry her the whole way. But he had to try. He explained with gestures what he was going to do. Then, as carefully as he could, he helped her sit up and positioned himself so he could lift her. She was heavier than he expected, and pain shot through his back as he stood, but he gritted his teeth and started walking. The journey back to the cabin was the longest walk of Thomas's life. His arms burned. His legs trembled. He had to stop every few minutes to rest, carefully setting the girl down and then picking her up again. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring words he couldn't understand, sometimes going completely silent. The sun was setting by the time Thomas finally saw his cabin through the trees. His whole body was shaking with exhaustion, but he pushed himself those last few yards. He managed to get the door open with his foot and carried the girl inside. He laid her down on the only real bed in the cabin, the one that had belonged to his parents. It felt strange to put someone else there, but it was the most comfortable place, and she needed it more than he did. As Thomas stood there, catching his breath and looking at this stranger in his cabin, the reality of what he'd just done started to sink in. He'd brought a wounded native girl into his home. He had no idea who she was, where she'd come from, or who might be looking for her. He'd just acted on instinct, on the values his parents had taught him. Now, as darkness fell outside, Thomas realized he'd committed himself to something much bigger than just finding an injured person in the woods. He'd made a choice that could change everything, and there was no going back now. Thomas's hands wouldn't stop shaking as he lit the lantern in his cabin. The warm glow filled the small room, and he could finally see the girl's wound clearly. It looked worse than he'd thought. The gash ran from just above her knee down to her shin, deep enough that he could see it needed serious care. He'd watched his mother tend to injuries before. She'd cleaned his father's cuts after work accidents, had helped neighbors who'd hurt themselves. Thomas tried to remember everything she'd done, every step she'd taken. His medical supplies were limited. A small tin of salve his mother had made from herbs, some clean cloth that had once been an old bedsheet, a bottle of whiskey his father had kept for emergencies. First, he needed water. Thomas grabbed his bucket and ran out to the creek. The cool evening air hit his face, and for a moment he just stood there breathing hard. What was he doing? He was 12 years old, alone trying to save a stranger who couldn't even speak his language. But there was no one else. If he didn't help her, she would die. It was that simple. He filled the bucket and hurried back. The girl was conscious now, her eyes following him as he moved around the cabin. He could see the fear in her expression, but also something else. Maybe trust, maybe just the resignation of someone who had no other choice. Thomas heated some of the water over his fire and found the cleanest cloth he had. When he approached the bed, the girl tensed. He showed her the cloth and the warm water, trying to communicate what he needed to do. She seemed to understand and gave a small nod. Cleaning the wound was harder than he'd imagined. The girl bit down on her lip, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't scream. Thomas had to pause several times because his own eyes were watering. He hated causing her pain, but he knew infection would be worse. He poured some of the whiskey over the wound, and this time she did cry out. Her hand grabbed his arm, squeezing so hard it hurt, but he kept working. Once the wound was clean, Thomas applied the salve his mother had made. It smelled of pine and something else he couldn't identify. Then he carefully wrapped the leg with strips of clean cloth, trying to make it tight enough to help, but not so tight it would cut off circulation. His hands were steadier now, focused on the task. When he finally finished, he sat back and wiped the sweat from his forehead. The girl was breathing heavily, exhausted from the pain. Thomas realized she probably hadn't eaten in a long time. He needed to get food into her, to give her strength to fight off infection and heal. His own stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten since morning either. He went to his small pantry, a wooden box where he kept his food. The supplies looked even more meager than usual. A few potatoes, some dried beans that would take hours to cook, half a jar of preserves, and one precious loaf of bread he'd baked 3 days ago. Thomas had planned to make that bread last the rest of the week. He'd been rationing it carefully, cutting thin slices each day to go with his other food. But looking at the girl lying weak on the bed, he didn't hesitate. He broke the bread in half. He poured some water into his only pot and set it near the fire to warm. Then he tore one half of the bread into small pieces and dropped them into the warm water, letting them soften. It made a simple porridge, nothing fancy, but it would be easy for her to eat and digest. While the bread softened, Thomas peeled and cut one of his potatoes into small chunks. He added it to his pot with some water and hung it over the fire. It wasn't much of a meal, but it was what he had. The girl watched him work. Thomas wondered what she was thinking. Was she afraid he might hurt her? Was she worried about her family? Did she think he expected something in return for helping her? When the bread porridge was ready, Thomas brought it to her in his only bowl with his only spoon. The girl tried to sit up but winced in pain. Thomas helped her, propping her up with the thin pillow from his own bedroll. Then he offered her the bowl. She looked at the food, then at him, then back at the food. Her hand trembled as she took the spoon. She ate slowly, carefully, as if she wasn't sure whether to trust it. But hunger won over caution, and soon she was eating more steadily. Thomas watched, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and worry. He'd given away half his bread, one of his potatoes. He'd have to make do with less for the next few days. But as he watched the color slowly return to her face, as he saw her regain a bit of strength, he knew he'd made the right choice. His father used to say that having enough to share was a blessing, and sharing it was what made you human. When she finished the porridge, Thomas brought her some water in his cup. She drank deeply, and for the first time she looked directly into his eyes and said something in her language. He didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. "Thank you." Thomas nodded and tried to smile. Then he realized he needed to eat too. He ladled out some of the potato soup he'd made, leaving most of it for her to have later if she woke up hungry during the night. He ate standing up quickly, his mind racing with everything that needed to be done. He needed to keep her comfortable. He needed to watch for signs of fever or infection. He needed to change her bandage regularly, and he needed to figure out what to do next. Should he try to find her people? Should he wait for her to get strong enough to tell him where she came from? What if someone was already looking for her? After he finished eating, Thomas made himself a bed on the floor using some old blankets. The cabin only had one bed, and the girl needed it more than he did. It wasn't that different from where he usually slept anyway. He'd given the bed to his parents when they were sick, and had never felt right sleeping there after they died. As night settled in completely, Thomas checked on the girl one more time. She was asleep now, her breathing more regular than before. Her face looked peaceful despite the pain she must still be feeling. Thomas lay down on his makeshift bed and stared at the ceiling. The cabin felt different with someone else in it. Less empty, less lonely. It had been so long since he'd heard another person breathing nearby, since he'd shared his space with anyone. He thought about his parents and wondered if they would be proud of what he'd done. He thought about the girl and wondered who she was, what her life was like, whether her family was looking for her right now. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, Thomas's dreams were filled with images of his mother's gentle smile and his father's approving nod. Somewhere deep in his heart, beneath all the worry and fear, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he'd done something that mattered. Thomas woke up before dawn like he always did. But this morning was different. For the first time in months, he wasn't alone. He could hear soft breathing coming from the bed across the room. For just a second, still half asleep, he thought maybe his mother was there. Then reality came back and he remembered the girl. He got up quietly and checked on her. She was still sleeping, but her forehead felt warm when he gently touched it. Not burning with fever, just warm. That was good. Thomas had been terrified she'd develop an infection overnight. He'd seen what infection could do. It had taken a neighbor's son just 2 years ago. Started from a simple cut that didn't heal right. The wound needed to be checked, and the bandage changed. Thomas prepared fresh cloth and more warm water. When he approached the bed, the girl's eyes opened. She looked confused for a moment, probably trying to remember where she was. Then she saw him and seemed to relax slightly. Thomas pointed to her leg and then to the bandages, trying to show her what he needed to do. She nodded and braced herself. Unwrapping the bandage, Thomas was relieved to see the wound looked better than yesterday. Still serious, still needing care, but not infected. Not yet anyway. He cleaned it again, applied more salve, and wrapped it with fresh cloth. The girl watched him work, and when he finished, she reached out and touched his hand. Just a brief touch, but it felt like communication, like she was trying to tell him she understood he was helping her. After that, Thomas made breakfast. More bread porridge for her, since her stomach probably couldn't handle much else yet. For himself, he boiled 2 eggs from his chickens and ate them with the smallest piece of bread. His supplies were getting lower, but he tried not to think about that. He brought the girl her food and helped her sit up. This time she managed to hold the bowl herself, though her hand still shook a bit. While she ate, Thomas said his name slowly, pointing to himself. "Thomas." He repeated it twice. She looked at him with understanding in her eyes. Then she pointed to herself and said something that sounded like Ayana. Her voice was soft but clear. Thomas tried to repeat it, got it wrong, tried again. She smiled a little, and he knew he'd gotten close enough. It was a start, a small bridge between 2 people who didn't share a language. Over the next few days, they built on that bridge word by word, gesture by gesture. Thomas learned that Ayana was indeed from a tribe in the northern mountains. She showed him by pointing north and making shapes with her hands that suggested mountains. She'd been out with a hunting party when she got separated. She made walking gestures with her fingers, then a stumbling motion, then pointed to her leg. He understood. She'd fallen, probably down a ravine or off a rock. Ayanna learned about Thomas too, though the story was harder to tell without words. He took her outside one morning, supporting her weight as she hopped on one leg. He showed her the two graves behind the cabin under the oak tree. He didn't need to say anything. She understood loss. Her eyes grew sad and she placed her hand over her heart, a gesture that needed no translation. As Ayanna grew stronger, she started helping around the cabin. At first, Thomas tried to stop her. She needed rest, needed to heal, but she was stubborn. She'd point to things that needed doing and insist on helping despite his protests. She noticed his torn shirt, the one he'd ripped up to make bandages for her leg. Using gestures, she asked if he had thread and a needle. Thomas found his mother's old sewing kit, something he'd never learned to use properly. He watched amazed as Ayanna mended not just that shirt, but two others that had been sitting in a pile for months. Her stitches were small and neat, making the repairs almost invisible. She organized his pantry, arranging things in a way that made more sense than his random system. She showed him how to braid rope from plant fibers, a skill that would be useful for countless things, and she taught him about plants. One afternoon, she hobbled to the door and pointed outside. Thomas helped her into the clearing, and she began pointing at various plants growing wild around his cabin. Some he recognized, some he didn't. She would pull a leaf, smell it, sometimes taste a tiny bit, and then make gestures to show him what it was good for. A plant with small purple flowers was for stomach aches. She rubbed her belly and made a face of discomfort, then pretended to eat the flower and smiled. A certain type of moss could be used to dress wounds even better than cloth. She pointed to her leg, then to the moss. A root that looked like nothing special could be boiled to make a tea that helped with fevers. Thomas tried to remember everything. He wished he could write it all down, but he'd never been good at letters. His parents had taught him basics, but not much more. So he memorized as best he could, repeating the information in his head over and over. In return, Thomas taught Ayanna things too. He showed her how to collect eggs from the chickens without startling them, how to tell which vegetables in the garden were ready to pick, how to set snares for rabbits in the most effective places. They developed their own way of communicating, a mix of gestures, facial expressions, and the few words they'd learned from each other. Water was one of the first English words Ayanna learned. Fire was another. Thomas learned words from her language too, though he couldn't always pronounce them right. The word for friend was important. They both learned that one. Evenings became Thomas's favorite time. After the day's work was done, they'd sit by the fire. Sometimes Ayanna would hum songs from her people, melodies that sounded different from anything Thomas had heard before. Sometimes Thomas would tell stories using lots of gestures and simple words about his life, his parents, the things he remembered. One night, Ayanna drew pictures in the ashes around the fireplace. She drew what looked like teepees in a circle, then small figures. She pointed to one figure and said her name. Then she pointed to other figures, 4 of them. She held up 3 fingers, then pointed to 2 of the smaller figures. Thomas understood. She had 3 younger siblings. Then she pointed to 2 larger figures, her parents. Thomas felt his chest tighten. Her family must be so worried about her. They probably thought she was dead. How long had it been now? 5 days? 6? He'd lost track. He drew his own picture. His cabin just like it was. Then 2 figures lying down behind it. The graves. Then himself alone. Ayanna looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she did something that surprised him. She drew a line connecting his figure to her family. She pointed to him, then to herself, then made a gesture like putting things together. Thomas wasn't sure exactly what she meant, but it felt like she was saying he wasn't alone anymore. That somehow, through this strange situation, they'd become connected, like family maybe, or at least like people who cared about each other. That night, as Thomas lay on his floor bed and listened to Ayanna sleeping peacefully across the room, he realized something had changed inside him. The crushing loneliness that had been his constant companion since his parents died had lifted a bit. Not gone completely, but lighter. He'd helped someone. Someone had helped him back. They'd shared food and work and space. They'd learned from each other. And even though they came from completely different worlds, spoke different languages, looked different and lived different lives, they'd found something in common. They'd found kindness. Thomas didn't know what would happen next. He knew Ayanna would eventually need to return to her people. He knew this couldn't last forever. But for now, in this moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like things might actually be okay. He felt like maybe he wasn't completely alone in the world after all. By the 7th day, Ayanna could walk without help, though she still had a noticeable limp. Thomas watched her move around the cabin with mixed feelings. He was glad she was healing so well. The wound was closing nicely with no signs of infection, but her recovery also meant she would soon be strong enough to leave, and that thought filled him with unexpected sadness. The cabin felt different now, with someone else in it. It felt alive in a way it hadn't since his parents died. There was someone to share meals with, someone to work alongside, someone to sit with in the evenings. Thomas had gotten used to the companionship, and the thought of returning to the crushing silence and loneliness made his chest feel tight. But he knew it was selfish to want her to stay. Ayanna had a family who loved her, who must be mourning her loss right now. She needed to go back to them. And honestly, keeping her here any longer felt wrong. She belonged with her people, not in this lonely cabin with a boy she'd met by accident. That evening, as they sat by the fire after finishing their simple dinner of bean soup and the last of the bread, Ayanna seemed quieter than usual. She stared into the flames with a faraway look in her eyes. Thomas recognized that expression. He'd worn it himself many times. She was thinking about home. After a while, Ayanna reached over and picked up a stick. She began drawing in the ashes again, something they'd done many times over the past week to communicate. But tonight was different. Tonight she drew with more detail and purpose. First, she drew mountains, several peaks in a row. She pointed north toward the direction she'd indicated before. Then she drew what looked like a valley between the mountains, and in that valley she drew circles. Many circles arranged in a pattern. Her village, Thomas understood. Next, she drew figures inside and around those circles. She pointed to one and said her name. Then she drew 4 smaller figures clustered around the first one. She held up 3 fingers, pointed to 3 of the smaller figures, then rocked her arms like holding a baby. Her younger siblings. Thomas's heart ached watching her. She missed them so much. Then Ayanna drew 2 taller figures standing near the group. She touched her chest over her heart, then pointed to these 2 figures. Her parents. She looked at Thomas with eyes that were starting to shine with tears. She said something in her language, words he didn't understand, but the emotion behind them was crystal clear. She needed to go home. They needed to know she was alive. Thomas nodded slowly. He pointed to her, then to the mountains in the drawing, then made a walking gesture. "You go home," he said in English, then tried to say it in the few words of her language he'd learned. But Ayanna shook her head. She pointed to herself, then to Thomas, then drew a line connecting them in the ash. She pointed to the drawings of her family, then to Thomas, then back to her family. She was trying to tell him something more, something important. She drew another figure in the ash separate from the others. She pointed to it, then to Thomas. She pointed to his parents' graves visible through the window, then back to the lone figure. She was showing him that she understood he was alone, just like she'd been alone when she was injured and lost. Then she did something that made Thomas's breath catch. She drew that lone figure walking toward her village. She pointed to Thomas, then to herself, then to the mountains. She gestured as if pulling him along, bringing him with her. Thomas's mind raced. Was she inviting him to come with her? To meet her people? The idea was both exciting and terrifying. He'd never met native people before except for Ayanna. What if they didn't trust him? What if they thought he'd hurt her or captured her? What if they saw him as an enemy? He tried to explain his fears through gestures. He pointed to himself, then to her people in the drawing, then made a worried face and shook his head. But Ayanna was insistent. She pointed to her healing leg, then to Thomas, then made a gentle, caring gesture. She was telling him that she would explain what he'd done, that she would make sure they understood he'd saved her life. Still, Thomas hesitated. Leaving his cabin, his parents' graves, everything familiar felt impossible. This was his home, his only connection to his family. How could he just walk away from it? Ayanna seemed to sense his struggle. She pointed to the drawings of the graves, then placed both hands over her heart. She pointed to Thomas's chest, then to his head. She was saying that his parents would always be with him, in his heart and in his memories. The graves were just earth and stones. What mattered was what he carried inside. Then she made a gesture that surprised him. She pretended to shiver, hugging herself as if cold. She pointed to the coming winter. made gestures of snow falling, of harsh cold. She pointed to Thomas alone in the cabin, then shook her head firmly. She was worried about him surviving the winter by himself. Thomas realized she was right to worry. Last winter had been brutal, and he'd had more supplies then. This year his stores were already low. He'd used up precious food helping Ayana heal. How would he make it through months of snow and ice alone? What if he got sick or injured with no one to help him? But still, the idea of leaving everything behind, of going to live with people he didn't know in a place completely foreign to him, was overwhelming. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening forest. His whole life was here. His memories, his parents' things, the land they'd worked together. Ayana came and stood beside him, balancing carefully on her healing leg. She didn't say anything, just stood there offering silent support. After a long moment, she pointed to the graves again, then made a different gesture. She pretended to plant something in the ground, then made a growing motion with her hands. She touched her heart again. Thomas thought he understood. She was saying that his parents had planted something in him, love and values and strength, and that those things would keep growing no matter where he went. Leaving this place didn't mean abandoning them. It meant taking what they'd given him and moving forward with it. They stood there for a while in silence, both looking out at the forest. Finally, Ayana spoke in her own language, words Thomas didn't know. But then she said 3 words in English that she'd learned over the past week. "You not alone." Those simple words broke through something in Thomas. He'd been alone for so long, carrying everything by himself, surviving, but not really living. Maybe this was a chance for something different. Maybe this was why he'd found Ayana that day by the creek. Not just to help her, but so she could help him too. Thomas looked at Ayana and saw genuine care in her eyes. She wasn't just offering out of obligation or because she felt she owed him. She was offering because she'd come to care about what happened to him, the same way he'd come to care about her. He thought about his parents and what they would want for him. Would they want him to stay here alone, slowly using up his supplies until he had nothing left? Or would they want him to take a chance to find a new community, to live instead of just surviving? The answer seemed obvious when he thought about it that way. His mother had always said that life was meant to be lived with others, not alone. His father had taught him to be brave enough to try new things even when they scared him. Thomas took a deep breath and nodded slowly. He pointed to himself, then to Ayana, then to the mountains in her drawing. He was saying yes. He would go with her. He would meet her people and see what might be possible. Ayana's face lit up with the biggest smile he'd seen from her. She said something in her language that sounded joyful, then grabbed his hands and squeezed them. For the first time since his parents died, Thomas felt like he might actually have a future to look forward to, instead of just another day to survive. That night, they started making plans. Ayana drew more pictures, showing him the journey they would take. It would take them several days to reach her village, traveling slowly because of her leg. They would need to prepare food for the trip, gather supplies, and wait for her to be strong enough for the journey. Thomas felt nervous excitement bubbling up inside him. In a few days, his entire life was going to change. He didn't know what awaited him in those mountains, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving toward something instead of just holding on to the past. As they settled in for sleep that night, Thomas whispered to the darkness, talking to his parents like he sometimes did. He told them about his decision, about Ayana's offer, about his hope that this was the right choice. He told them he loved them and would never forget them. And somewhere deep in his heart, he felt like maybe they were telling him it was okay to let go, to move forward, to find a new place in the world. He felt like maybe they'd be proud of the choice he was making. Thomas had always been a light sleeper. Living alone in the wilderness had trained him to wake at the slightest unusual sound. So when the birds stopped singing that morning, even in his sleep, some part of him noticed. When the usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush went silent, his eyes opened. The cabin was still dark, but there was that quality to the darkness that meant dawn was close. Maybe another half hour before sunrise. Thomas lay still on his floor bed for a moment, trying to figure out what had woken him. Everything seemed normal inside the cabin. He could hear Ayana's steady breathing from the bed across the room. Then he heard it. Or rather, he heard the absence of it. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no cricket sounds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just an eerie, unnatural quiet that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Thomas sat up slowly, carefully, trying not to make noise. His father had taught him that when the forest went quiet, it usually meant predators were nearby. Mountain lions, sometimes bears. His hand instinctively reached for his rifle, which he always kept loaded and within reach. He moved to the window, staying low, and peered out into the pre-dawn darkness. At first he couldn't see anything unusual, just the familiar shapes of trees and his small clearing. But as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were shadows where shadows shouldn't be. Shapes that were too tall, too straight to be natural, and they were moving slowly, carefully taking positions around his cabin. Thomas's heart started pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He moved to the other window, then to the door, looking through every crack and gap he could find. The shapes were everywhere, completely surrounding the cabin. In the growing light, he could start to make out more details, people, dozens of them. And they were armed. His first thought was to run, but there was nowhere to go. They had the cabin surrounded. His second thought was to defend himself, but what could one 12-year-old boy do against so many? His hands were shaking as he gripped his rifle. Then understanding crashed over him like cold water. These weren't random attackers. These were Ayana's people. They'd found her, and they thought he'd captured her or hurt her. They'd come at dawn, the traditional time for attacks, when people were still groggy from sleep and least able to defend themselves. Thomas's mind raced through everything he'd heard about conflicts between settlers and native tribes. The stories of violence, of misunderstandings that turned deadly, of revenge and retaliation. He thought about how this must look from their perspective. Their daughter and sister had disappeared. Then they'd tracked her here to a settler's cabin. Of course they'd assume the worst. He needed to wake Ayana, but he was afraid to move. Afraid any sound might trigger an attack. The shapes outside had stopped moving now. They were just waiting, watching. Waiting for what? Sunrise, probably. Waiting for enough light to see clearly. Thomas's mouth was dry. His whole body felt cold despite the warmth of the cabin. He'd survived so much, losing his parents, living alone, struggling through hardship. Was this how it would end? Before he even got the chance to go with Ayana, to start a new life. He thought about his parents' graves behind the cabin. At least he'd be buried near them. The thought brought tears to his eyes, but also a strange kind of calm. If this was the end, at least he'd done something good with his last days. He'd helped someone who needed help. He'd shown kindness. His parents would be proud of that, even if it had led to this. But he couldn't just give up. He had to try something. He moved carefully to the bed where Ayana was sleeping. He touched her shoulder gently, and her eyes opened immediately. She looked at him, confused by the expression on his face. Thomas pointed to the window. He held a finger to his lips for silence, then gestured for her to look. Ayana got up, wincing slightly as weight went on her healing leg, and moved to the window. Her reaction was instant. Her eyes went wide, and she sucked in a sharp breath. She said something in her language. Words Thomas didn't understand, but the tone was shocked and worried. She looked at Thomas, then back at the window, then at Thomas again. He could see the understanding dawn in her eyes. She knew what this looked like. She knew her people had come for her, and what they must be thinking. Her face filled with distress, and she grabbed Thomas's arm, squeezing it tightly. She was trying to tell him something, trying to reassure him, but he couldn't understand the words. Outside, the sky was getting lighter. The shapes were becoming clearer now. Thomas could see men, warriors with bows and rifles. Some had painted their faces. They stood in a wide circle, every exit blocked. It was a perfect tactical position. Professional, organized. These weren't random attackers. This was a search party that had found what they were looking for. Thomas watched as one figure, taller than the others and standing with obvious authority, raised his hand. The gesture seemed to be a signal. All the warriors shifted slightly, preparing for something. The sunrise was minutes away now, and Thomas understood with sudden clarity that when the sun broke the horizon, whatever was going to happen would happen. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He put down his rifle, knowing it was useless anyway. What good was one gun against dozens? Using it would just guarantee his death. Maybe if he didn't resist, didn't threaten them, there was a chance they'd listen before acting. Ayana was saying something urgently, tugging at his arm, pointing to the door. She seemed to be telling him something important, but the fear and adrenaline made it hard for him to think clearly. Thomas looked at her, and realized she was trying to tell him to let her go out first, to let her explain. But what if they thought he'd forced her to say those things? What if they didn't believe her? What if seeing her injured made them even angrier? The first rays of sunlight began to paint the sky pink and gold. Beautiful, Thomas thought distantly. If these were his last moments, at least the world was beautiful. He thought of his mother's face, his father's laugh. He thought of Ayana's kindness and how glad he was that he'd helped her, whatever the cost. Outside, the warriors remained perfectly still, like statues arranged in a circle, waiting. The silence was so complete that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat, could hear Ayana's quick breathing beside him. The sun crept higher, its light spreading across the clearing. In that golden dawn light, Thomas could see the faces of the men surrounding his cabin more clearly now. Hard faces, weathered and serious, eyes that had seen hardship and loss. These were fathers and brothers and sons protecting their own. Thomas understood them in a way. If Ayana had been his sister, he'd have done the same thing. He'd have tracked her down and surrounded whoever had her. The difference was they didn't know yet that he'd helped her, not hurt her. They didn't know they'd found a friend, not an enemy. The sun was almost fully up now. Thomas could feel the moment approaching like a physical thing. He looked at Ayana one last time, trying to put all his gratitude and care into that look, trying to tell her without words that he didn't regret helping her, that knowing her had been worth whatever came next. She looked back at him with tears in her eyes and determination on her face. She squeezed his hand once hard, then moved toward the door. This was it, the moment of truth. Thomas took a deep breath and prepared himself for whatever fate had in store. The sun broke fully over the horizon, flooding the world with light, and everything he'd known was about to change forever. Thomas tried to grab Ayana's arm to stop her, but she was already moving toward the door. His heart hammered in his chest as she reached for the wooden latch. Every instinct screamed at him that this was dangerous, that opening that door could be the last thing either of them ever did. But Ayana was determined. She looked back at him one more time, and in her eyes he saw something that made him let go. She wasn't afraid. Well, maybe she was afraid, but she was also confident. She trusted her people. She believed they would listen. The door swung open, and Ayana stepped out onto the small porch. Thomas stayed in the doorway, half hidden but visible. He couldn't leave her to face this alone, even if it meant putting himself in danger. The morning air was cool and crisp. The sun was just clearing the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. And in that clear morning light, Thomas could see them all. There were easily 30 warriors surrounding the cabin, maybe more. They stood silent and still, watching. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The world seemed to hang suspended, waiting to see what would happen next. Then Ayana lifted both hands, palms out, showing she was unarmed. She called out in her language, her voice clear and strong despite the slight tremor Thomas could hear underneath. She was speaking quickly, urgently, and though Thomas couldn't understand the words, he could hear the tone. She was explaining, pleading maybe, trying to make them understand. The warriors remained motionless. Their eyes moved from Ayana to Thomas and back again. He could see them taking in details. Ayana's bandaged leg, her limp as she stood on the porch. The fact that she was clean and fed and clearly had been cared for. Then the tall warrior Thomas had noticed earlier, the one who seemed to be the leader, stepped forward. He was older than most of the others, with gray streaking his long dark hair. His face was weathered with lines that spoke of years of wisdom and leadership. This had to be someone important. A chief, maybe, or a respected elder. The man's eyes locked onto Thomas, and Thomas felt like he was being looked through rather than at. It was a gaze that saw everything, that judged and assessed in seconds. Thomas forced himself not to look away, not to show fear even though his legs felt like water. Ayana was still talking, her words coming faster now. She pointed to her leg, gestured to Thomas, made movements that looked like she was describing her injury and his care. She walked across the porch, deliberately showing her limp, showing the clean bandage, showing that she was healing. Then she did something that made Thomas's breath catch. She walked back to him and took his hand, pulling him forward gently so he was fully visible on the porch. She held their joined hands up and spoke directly to the older warrior, saying something with emphasis and emotion. Thomas stood there, his hand in Ayana's, completely exposed and vulnerable. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, Some of those eyes were hard and cold, some were merely curious, but all of them were watching, waiting to see what their leader would decide. The older warrior studied them for what felt like an eternity. Then he spoke, and his voice was deep and commanding. He said something in their language, and Thomas heard his own name in the middle of the foreign words. Ayana must have told them his name at some point. Ayana responded, speaking rapidly again. She let go of Thomas's hand and began miming actions. She showed falling down, showed injury, showed pain. Then she pretended to be Thomas, discovering her, carrying her. She pointed to the cabin, made caring gestures, showed feeding and bandaging. She was telling the whole story through words and actions, making sure they understood everything. Thomas watched the faces of the warriors as she spoke. Some of them were starting to look less hostile. A few even looked surprised. They were understanding. They were seeing that their assumptions had been wrong. When Ayana finished speaking, there was another long silence. Then the older warrior looked at Thomas directly and spoke. Thomas had no idea what he was saying, but he felt the weight of the words. This was judgment being passed, a decision being made that would determine his fate. The warrior walked forward slowly, crossing the clearing toward the porch. Thomas's instinct was to back up, to put space between them, but he forced himself to stand still. Running would only make things worse. He had to trust Ayana. He had to trust that her people were fair, that they would see the truth. The older warrior climbed the 2 steps onto the porch and stood directly in front of Thomas. Up close, he was even more imposing. Taller, broader, with eyes that had seen more than Thomas could imagine. This was a man who had led his people through good times and bad, who had made life and death decisions. Thomas looked up at him, trying to keep his expression open and honest. He didn't know what else to do. He couldn't speak their language. He couldn't explain himself. All he could do was stand there and hope that somehow this man could see into his heart and know that he'd meant no harm. The warrior reached out, and Thomas flinched slightly before catching himself. But the man's hand wasn't reaching to harm. Instead, he gently lifted Thomas's hands, turning them palm up, studying them. Thomas's hands were rough from work, scarred from various injuries, small and young but strong from necessity. Then the warrior looked at the cabin behind Thomas, taking in the simple poverty of it. The patched roof, the small garden, the 2 lonely graves visible behind the building. His eyes moved back to Thomas, and something in his expression shifted. He said something to Ayana, who responded briefly. Then the warrior looked back at Thomas, and slowly, deliberately, he placed his hand over his own heart. He held it there for a moment, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. Then he bowed his head just slightly, just enough. Thomas didn't know what to do. Was this good? Was this bad? He looked at Ayana desperately, trying to understand. Ayana was smiling, tears streaming down her face. She said something in English, one of the phrases she'd learned. Is good. Is very good. The older warrior stepped back and spoke loudly to the assembled warriors. His tone had changed completely. It was no longer threatening or tense. It was something else. Something that sounded almost welcoming. The warriors began to lower their weapons. Some of them were talking among themselves now, the rigid silence broken. A few were looking at Thomas with what might have been respect. The circle that had surrounded the cabin like a trap was dissolving into something less threatening. Then people started moving toward the cabin. Not in attack, but in approach. Women had been hanging back behind the warriors, and now they came forward. Children, too. This wasn't just a war party. This was Ayana's whole family and community come to find her. An older woman rushed past the others and up onto the porch. She went straight to Ayana, pulling her into a fierce embrace. Both women were crying and talking rapidly. This had to be Ayana's mother. The resemblance was clear in their faces. A man came next, younger than the elder warrior, but still mature, with the same strong features as Ayana. Her father, probably. He hugged her tightly, then examined her leg with concerned hands, speaking urgently. 3 smaller figures darted up the steps, and Ayana laughed through her tears as her younger siblings mobbed her with hugs. They were all talking at once, touching her as if to make sure she was real. Through all of this, Thomas stood to the side, not knowing what to do or where to look. He was happy for Ayana, truly happy to see her reunited with her family, but he also felt very much like an outsider, someone who didn't belong in this moment. Then Ayana turned to him, still holding her youngest sibling. She said something to her family, gesturing to Thomas. Her mother turned and looked at him, really looked at him. Then she came toward him, and Thomas wasn't sure what to expect. The woman reached out and cupped Thomas's face in both her hands. She said something in her language, words he didn't understand, but that sounded gentle, grateful. Then she pulled him into a hug, holding him like she'd held Ayanna, like he was precious. Thomas stood stiff in surprise for a moment, then slowly raised his arms and hugged her back. He couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged him like this, not since his own mother died. The kindness of it, the acceptance, broke something open inside him. Tears started rolling down his cheeks before he could stop them. When the woman stepped back, she kept one hand on his shoulder, saying something else. The older warrior, the chief, spoke again, and this time Thomas heard a different tone entirely. It sounded like invitation, like welcome. Ayanna limped over to Thomas and took his hand again. She looked at him with shining eyes and said in her careful English, "You, family now, you'd come home, with us." Thomas looked around at all these people, these strangers who minutes ago had surrounded his cabin like enemies. Now they were looking at him with acceptance, with gratitude, with openness. The older warrior nodded at him with something that looked like approval. Ayanna's family was smiling. Even some of the younger warriors looked friendly now. Thomas thought about his empty cabin, his loneliness, his uncertain future. Then he looked at these people who were offering him something he thought he'd lost forever. A place to belong, a community to be part of, people who would care whether he lived or died. He squeezed Ayanna's hand and nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. He was saying yes. Yes to the unknown. Yes to trust. IFAH. The next few hours passed in a blur for Thomas. Once the tension broke and Ayanna's people understood what had really happened, everything changed completely. The warriors who had surrounded his cabin with weapons now helped him in ways he never expected. The chief, whose name Thomas learned sounded like Dakota, walked through the cabin with a careful eye. He looked at the thin walls, the leaking roof, the meager supplies. He saw the 2 graves behind the cabin and stood there for a long moment, his hand over his heart. When he came back inside, he spoke to the other men in a commanding tone. What happened next amazed Thomas. The warriors didn't just leave. They started bringing things from the packs their horses carried. Thick furs that would keep out the winter cold, dried meat wrapped in leather enough to last months, bags of ground corn and dried berries. Tools that Thomas didn't even know the names for, but that looked well-made and useful. Ayanna's mother, whose name was something like Kimi, went through Thomas's pathetic food stores with a sad expression. She shook her head and said something to the other women who had come. They immediately began organizing, sorting, teaching Thomas through gestures how to better preserve and store food. One of the younger warriors, maybe 18 or 19 years old, approached Thomas with a beautiful bow and a quiver of arrows. He demonstrated drawing the bow, then offered it to Thomas. When Thomas hesitated, Ayanna translated as best she could. Gift. For hunting. You. Need. Thomas accepted the bow with shaking hands. It was the finest weapon he'd ever held, smooth and perfectly balanced. He tried to express his thanks, stumbling over the few words of their language he'd learned and gesturing his gratitude. The young warrior smiled and patted his shoulder, then spent the next hour showing Thomas how to properly use the bow. His father's rifle was good, but ammunition was expensive and hard to get. A bow, though, with arrows he could make himself once he learned how. That was something sustainable. Dakota approached Thomas as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The chief gestured for Thomas to walk with him. They went to the graves behind the cabin, and there, in the quiet morning, Dakota spoke. Thomas couldn't understand most of the words, but he understood the tone. Respect, recognition of loss, acknowledgement of Thomas's grief. Then Dakota did something unexpected. He pulled a leather cord from around his neck. Hanging from it was a small carved stone, worn smooth from years of wear. He held it out to Thomas, saying something in a solemn tone. Ayanna, who had followed them, translated haltingly. He say, "This protect his son gone now, like your father, your mother." He say, "You wear now. You need protection, you, like son now." Thomas's vision blurred with tears. He took the necklace with trembling hands and put it around his neck. The stone was warm from Dakota's body heat. Thomas placed his own hand over his heart. copying the gesture of respect he'd seen the chief make, and bowed his head. Dakota gripped Thomas's shoulder firmly, saying something else. Ayana translated. He say, "You not alone anymore. You have people now." As the day went on, more gifts came, not just practical things for survival, but things that showed Thomas was being accepted into their community. A woman gave him a beautifully woven blanket. A child brought him a small carved figure of a bear. An older man presented him with a knife in a decorated sheath. Each gift came with words Thomas didn't fully understand, but felt in his heart. These people were telling him that what he'd done for Ayana mattered. That kindness to one of them was kindness to all of them, that he was no longer an outsider. But the most important conversation happened in the afternoon. Dakota, speaking through Ayana's careful translation, made Thomas an offer that would change his life forever. He say, Ayana worked to find the English words, "You come to our village, live with us, learn our ways. We teach you hunt better, find food, stay warm in winter. You, too young to be alone, not safe." Thomas looked around his cabin at everything his parents had built. "But my home," he said, gesturing to the cabin, to the land. Ayana translated his concern to Dakota. The chief thought for a moment, then spoke at length. Ayana worked hard to translate. He say, "Cabin's still yours. You come back when you want, but winter coming. Very hard winter. You here alone? Maybe you not survive. Come to village, learn, grow strong. Then decide. Maybe you come back. Maybe you stay with us. Your choice. Always your choice. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation." They were offering him a place while still respecting his connection to this land and his parents' memory. Thomas felt the wisdom in this approach. He was being given options, not orders. Over the next few days, Thomas prepared to leave with Ayana's people. They helped him secure the cabin against weather and animals. They showed him how to properly cache food so it would still be good if he returned. They even helped him build a stronger fence around his parents' graves to protect them. Dakota assigned 2 young warriors to periodically check on the cabin during winter, to make sure it remained standing and secure. "Your home," he said through Ayana. "We protect." The morning they were set to leave, Thomas stood at his parents' graves one last time. He'd brought flowers he'd found growing wild, the last blooms before winter. He placed them carefully on each grave. "I'm not abandoning you," he whispered. I'm doing what you'd want me to do. I'm going to live, not just survive. I'm going to learn and grow and be part of something bigger. But I'll never forget you. I promise." A gentle hand touched his shoulder. Ayana stood beside him, no longer limping. Her leg had healed remarkably well. "They proud of you," she said softly in English. "I know. They very proud." The journey to Ayana's village took 4 days. Thomas rode one of their horses, something he'd never done before. At night they camped under the stars, and Thomas learned their ways of making fire, setting up shelter, and traveling safely through the wilderness. The other young people in the group, once they got over their initial shyness, began teaching Thomas words in their language. He taught them English words in return. They laughed at each other's pronunciation and bonded over shared mistakes. When they finally reached the village nestled in the mountain valley, Thomas was stunned by what he saw. It was bigger than he'd imagined, more organized, more beautiful. The teepees were arranged in careful circles, and people moved about their daily tasks with purpose and community. Children ran up to greet the returning party, and news of Thomas spread quickly. People came out to see the settler boy who had saved Dakota's niece. Thomas felt overwhelmed by the attention, but Ayana stayed close, helping him navigate the curious stares and questions. Dakota made a formal announcement to the village, speaking about what Thomas had done. Thomas didn't need translation to understand that the chief was vouching for him, bringing him under the tribe's protection. In the days and weeks that followed, Thomas began to find his place in this new world. He was given a spot in Dakota's own dwelling, treated like family. The chief's wife fussed over how thin he was and made sure he ate well. Other children, including Ayana's younger siblings, adopted him into their games and activities. He learned to hunt properly, not just setting snares, but tracking game and using his new bow effectively. He learned which plants were useful for medicine, food, and tools. He learned their language slowly but surely, until he could have simple conversations. He learned their stories, their beliefs, their ways of seeing the world. But more than skills, Thomas learned what it meant to be part of a community again. There were people who cared if he was warm enough at night. People who showed him how to do things he didn't know. People who laughed at his jokes and included him in their celebrations. People who mourned with him when he had sad days missing his parents. Ayana became like a sister to him. She'd already felt like family, but now it was official. Her siblings became his siblings. Her parents treated him with the same care they showed their own children. And Dakota, stern and wise, became the father figure Thomas had lost. Winter came, harsh and cold just as predicted. Thomas was grateful every day that he wasn't alone in his cabin trying to survive it. Instead, he was warm and fed and surrounded by people. He learned winter crafts, heard winter stories, and found joy even in the darkest, coldest months. When spring finally arrived, Dakota asked Thomas what he wanted to do. Did he want to return to his cabin? Did he want to stay? Thomas thought about it carefully. He did go back to visit his cabin, to check on it and tend his parents' graves. But he realized that the cabin wasn't home anymore. Home was where people cared about you. Home was where you belonged. I want to stay, he told Dakota in the chief's own language, speaking slowly but clearly. If you'll have me. Dakota smiled, something he didn't do often, and placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. You are already ours, he said. You became ours the moment you chose kindness over fear. Years later, Thomas would sometimes think back to that terrifying dawn when warriors had surrounded his cabin, how his fear had transformed into acceptance, his loneliness into belonging, his isolation into community. He'd shared his last bread with a wounded stranger, expecting nothing in return. And somehow, that simple act of compassion had given him everything he'd lost and more. He'd learned that family wasn't just about blood. It was about who showed up for you,